Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today. It's 12 o'clock, Australian Eastern. It's not summertime, it's daylight time. So we'll standard time, I think. So we'll get underway very shortly. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Norman Shawn, as you can probably see, and I'm really excited to be here today. This has actually been a fairly interesting journey for me. In addition to all the research that I've been doing into things like resilience and organizational adaptation and growth, particularly in times of uncertainty, I've also done a lot of thinking about how we make sense of the future, how people see into the future. And I'm really excited to share with you some of my latest thinking on this particular topic. It's a really interesting kind of space, and I hope you all find what we're going to share today to be particularly interesting and useful. Just a bit of background. Some of you would know that I really have a background in both economics and behavioral science, and I guess that one of the things we're going to be doing today is really sharing how this combination of strategy and economics on the one hand and behavioral science and neuroscience on the other side really produce some very different and understandings about the way that people, particularly successful people and leaders, can see into the future. Just again, by way of background, I did spend about 2 years just prior and during the pandemic really looking at organizations who had managed to do particularly well during the period of the disruption and the lockdown. And these are organizations that we wanted to try and understand a little more. We wanted to know how they were able to cope with the disruption, how they were able to manage the change, how they were able to really develop this level of resilience, which has characterized their performance for such a long time. And so I guess what we found was one of the important characteristics being the real issue of being able to understand and really see quite deeply into the future. So this is really what I'd like to share with you today. I'd like to share with you some of these latest thinkings and thoughts and some of the research findings, and I've tried to put it together in a way that hopefully you will find quite practical and quite useful. So without any further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll get straight into it. So the topic, as you know, is how successful leaders see into the future. And we've discovered that there are a number of characteristics, there are a number of behaviors that they all seem to display. There are a number of practices that they all seem to follow to enable them to see successfully into the future. So let's have a look at the agenda and what we're going to cover today. Essentially, we're going to look at three things. And I think it all really centers around this really interesting quote by, we're not sure if it was Yogi Berra or Robert Graves. That quote is attributed to both of them. But, you know, what is the challenge? I mean, what's the big deal about the future? What's the challenge that it represents to us? What prevents us from seeing the future? And finally, what can we as leaders do to a better job seeing into the future? So this is really what we're going to focus on today. There's a fairly short section up front about what is the challenge, and I think we'll start right there. Essentially, the big challenge about the future is the so-called arrow of time. Now, one thing I did want to mention to you before we get too far into this is that you have the ability to ask any questions as we go through this. And the way to do that is to use your chat box. I may not stop during the session unless I see a particularly important issue that really should be attended to straight away. But I will leave time at the end where all these questions will be answered and we'll have an opportunity to have a discussion. I will also stay online for a little longer afterwards in case there are some other areas of discussion that those of you who have a little bit of extra time would like to address. So back to our topic. What is the challenge of the future? Well, the challenge of the future is, I think, best summarized by drawing your attention to what we call the arrow of time. So in physics, there's this concept that time can be represented as an arrow. Now, we know that we have an ability to remember the past, but what is it that really stops us from having a memory of the future? And one of the things that we know from physics is that this whole concept of the arrow of time changes as we move forward through time and space. And the thing that really causes this to occur is something we know as entropy. So the problem here is that the arrow of time is not symmetrical. It doesn't allow us to remember the past and actually project into the future with the same level of accuracy. And the reason that the arrow of time is not symmetrical is because of the entropy that occurs. And entropy is a thermodynamic principle within physics that really changes the nature of a system. So let's start at the beginning and say that when we think about the present, when we think about our environment as it exists right now, it's really a collection of many, many elements which are tightly bound in a particular pattern. And that's really why we have this thing called the present, where we understand what's going on and all the things that are really happening. But as we move forward in time, this system breaks down. In the same way as our human bodies break down over time, the same way as machinery breaks down over time, or any material breaks down in time. And the reason they break down in time is this notion of entropy, which is the relationship between the elements or the atoms or the particles really start changing. And so we find that with this entropy and with time, what starts off as a single future, which we're all experiencing, really becomes a series of multiple futures. So I think the real challenge with time then is that we are unable, although we're able to remember and think about the past as something quite vividly and quite clearly, we aren't able to think about the future in the same way. And that is because of the entropy, which has really changed the nature of the variables and elements within the system that forms our environment. So what we know then is that uncertainty in our environment results in multiple futures. And as entropy takes place, so these environments spread out and the future pattern become more and more widespread. And we find we don't only face one future, we face multiple futures. Now, this is quite a crucial concept. And those of you that have done work in foresight, in futures thinking, in scenario thinking, will be familiar with this. But the point that's really important here is quite simply this, that as I stand here today and I look ahead into the future, I don't only see one future. There is no such thing as the future waiting for me to get to it. Because every time I do something, it changes some of the relationship between all those elements in the system. And as a result, the future keeps changing as we move closer to it. So this has got significant implications for the way we think about our future planning, when we think about how we might grow, when we think about how we might prepare our organizations for the future. The future is not singular, the future is multiple. Now, particularly with the events that we've all experienced over the last few years, we might think that the future is all about, I guess, what we've learned to call black swans. And a black swan is something that, is unexpected, is improbable, and completely disrupts the way we are thinking. In fact, what we really do know is that the future is not all about black swans only. It's also about grey rhinos. Now, what's a grey rhino? Well, this was a really interesting concept developed by Elizabeth Wirth. And she said that grey rhinos are things which we know about, but they're so far ahead into the future that we don't really bother preparing, planning for it, or even envisaging what it will be like when they occur. And I mean, many of you will know the old Australian saying, she'll be right, mate, it'll be right on the day. So we tend to think that these things which are far away, we'll be able to deal with them quite easily once they actually arrive. And I'm always reminded of Bob Dylan's song, which he wrote in 1967 called Slow Train Coming. Now, that song written in 67 was really all about his journey to Christianity when he converted to Christianity. But the meaning that I'd like to draw from it has got nothing to do with religion. It's got to do with the fact that if you imagine yourself on a railway station and you know there's a train far, far away, it's all very quiet, it's all very peaceful, people are just sitting around quite relaxed because the train's very far away. You're not really doing anything about it. And the train gets closer and closer and still nothing changes. And then all of a sudden, the train enters the station. There's noise, there's smoke, there's commotion, people running around, scrambling, looking for their bags, wondering where their children have gone to, and everyone tries to scramble to get ready to get onto the train. And this is really what we mean by a grey rhino, because when the grey rhino really comes, it actually does tend to disrupt us quite completely. But we also know that there are ways of actually preparing for the grey rhino. And those ways of preparing for the grey rhino are really about thinking about the future. But we know that we don't do such a great job in doing so. And I'm going to spend some time just sharing with you a few reasons why we can't see the future. So why is it that we can't see the future? Well, we know that it's really about the way our brain and our bodies have evolved over centuries, eons, thousands, millions of years. And there are some things that really prevent us quite naturally. It's not about not wanting to understand what the future is about. It's more about the fact that in some cases we're unable to. And I'd like to share 4 reasons why we are unable to really see the future, because these 4 reasons and an understanding of these 4 reasons will help us to really develop an approach and help hopefully improve our ability to see into the future. So the first thing I think is something that my colleagues, the neuroscientists, often get quite annoyed about when I tell them, our brains are actually lazy. They look to find the quickest pathway from point A to point B. But actually, this is really an evolutionary advantage, which we as Homo sapiens really developed. Because if you cast your mind back a hell of a long way, way before when you or I or any of our parents or ancestors were born, but around about the time we still lived in caves and we were learned to walk upright and hunt and really forage for our own food. One of the things that was a reality of those days was that food was very scarce and life was very dangerous. And because of that, our bodies and our brains developed this idea and this defense mechanism of conserving energy. So we never knew when our next meal would come along. And as a result, we ate as much as we could. It's one of the reasons why today we find that we are still attracted to very high calorie content foods, because our predisposition in our body suggests that we need to get as much calories, as much energy as quickly as possible. That's one of the reasons why dieting can be quite difficult. There are other parts of our body as well. If we are extremely cold, the body starts shutting off the end points of all our limbs, and it really tries to conserve its energy. And the last thing that really gets shut down is our brain, because that's probably considered to be one of the more important organs. So our brains are lazy, and because they're lazy, what they tend to do is they tend to think in terms of association. So if something looks similar, something new comes along and it looks similar to something we already know, we're likely to say, oh, it's the same as this thing. So we make this association. So A looks similar to B, therefore A must be the same as B, and we kind of treat B the same as we treat A. It's a fairly quick, lazy way to form opinions, to make decisions, and to try and understand what's going on around us. The second thing is really related to one of the key goals of our brain. And there's some dispute about what the one single overarching goal of the brain is. But a lot of people would tell you that the primary goal of the brain is to keep you safe from danger. The brain's purpose in this regard is, in fact, to move away from things that represent a threat or danger and move towards things that really offer some form of reward. And that really means that, in a sense, our natural instinct is to move away from loud noises, things that look dangerous, and move towards things that look quite attractive. The problem is that we have about 5 times more threat circuits in our brain than reward circuits. So we're actually more sensitive to the things that represent danger. And the key thing to remember here is that anything different, anything unusual, anything we don't recognize immediately is automatically signaled as danger. So the whole stranger danger concept is really what's relevant here. And because there's so much uncertainty and there's so much unknown about the future is regarded as dangerous. And as a consequence, we tend to back away from that rather than trying to explore it and understand it. The third reason is quite a strange one, and that is we actually have no memory of the future. So while we have memory of the past, we have no memory of the future. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because we probably aren't always aware of the role that memory plays in our decision-making. Memory is an important part in the way we come to conclusions and then the way we decide what action to take. And there are 2 kinds of memory here. The first is what we call episodic memory. Episodic memory is quite obviously related to the episodes in our life, experiences we've had. If we've fallen off our bicycle and hurt our knee, then that pain is in fact very real to us. So we can actually understand the danger of riding a bicycle. But semantic memory is the other kind of memory, and that's a different memory. It's formed in a different way. It's formed by what we read, what we learn, what we see on TV, what we hear other people talk about. So while we may never have actually ridden a bicycle in the Tour de France, we are actually well informed enough to know that it's a particularly arduous and difficult and tiring and demanding thing for any athlete. So one of the things that our memory does is it creates frameworks and structures whereby we interpret the events that we are seeing. And quite simply, if we don't have the structure of something that we've not learned or we don't have a memory of, we are unable to interpret what it really means. It's like somebody who's never studied astronomy. If they look up at the sky at night, all they see is just a range of stars scattered in quite a haphazard way. But if you studied astronomy, and you have a structure in your mind to interpret what all these things mean, you very quickly see all the star signs, you very quickly see and understand the Milky Way, you understand the various planets and where they're moving. So it's that memory, whether we've experienced it or learnt it, that allows us to interpret what's going on and to see into the future. And if we lack that memory, we can't make sense of what we're seeing unfolding in front of us, and therefore we simply don't see into the future. Now, the last one is an interesting concept. And this really talks about the biology of risk and uncertainty. So why do I talk about the biology of risk and uncertainty? Well, one of the things that may interest you is the fact that our body and our brain get affected by uncertainty. And this does strange things to the way we actually see the environment and the way we can respond to it. So you've obviously seen a diagram like this before. Some of you might recall that it's the diagram that is used often to describe the levels of stress we experience as individuals. And what I want to do is I want to use this diagram, but I want to use it with 2 slightly different axes. On the horizontal axis, I want to talk about the extent and how long the periods of volatility and uncertainty occur. So at the far end, it means it's taking place over a long period of time continuously. And on the other end, it means it's not really happening much at all. And on the vertical axis, I want you to think about the amount of risk-related behavior or entrepreneurial behavior which we as people will display or are prepared to take. So, I mean, you all understand that anything entrepreneurial involves taking a risk. So risk management, or the ability to take risks in entrepreneurial behavior, are very closely related. Now, if you look at the axis again, you'll see the green zone represents almost no volatility and uncertainty. The yellow, a bit of a sharper short period of volatility. The orange, an extended period, and the red, a continuous period of volatility and uncertainty. Now, one of the things that happens in our body when we're exposed to a short period of volatility or uncertainty is our body produces and our brain consumes this very potent cocktail of two neurotransmitters: dopamine, which is like the cocaine of the brain, which gives this feeling of euphoria and high and pleasure, and testosterone, which simply put really is your levels of energy you have to tackle things. So we find that where there's a short, sharp burst of volatility or uncertainty, which represents a potential opportunity as things change, we have this burst of dopamine and testosterone. And we kind of feel, oh my God, here's an opportunity. Things have changed. There's a gap in the market. There's an opportunity here. There's an unmet need. Let's actually get out and do something. So we feel then we move from a period of being fairly inactive and laid back, where there is no uncertainty, no volatility, or no stress, to a rise, a rapid and sharp rise in this risk-related and burst of entrepreneurial energy and activity. So that's a really important kind of thing to recognize, that we then are motivated by this opportunity that we see in the market, and we want to rush to really take advantage of it. Now, while the volatility and uncertainty is increasing in our environment, something else also happens. Another neurotransmitter, another neurochemical called cortisol increases. And this level of cortisol, which is the stress-related fight or flight that you're all familiar with, it really promotes this, getting ready to take action and defending yourself. This actually steadily increases as the level of uncertainty rises. Now, in the yellow stage, this level of cortisol is not enough to really affect our desire and our willingness to take risks and engage in entrepreneurial behavior. What actually happens as this level of cortisol increases with the level of uncertainty, we begin to get risk averse. We begin to say, oh, hold on, things are a bit sort of uncertain here. Things are getting dangerous. We don't really understand what's going on any longer. We need to just kind of play it easy. We need to play it cool. We need to avoid taking chances, and we need to start kind of playing it safe. And so we find that anxiety and risk really cause this reduction in levels of risk behavior, until we find that when we are highly stressed, we are also highly risk averse, and therefore we do not engage in any level of entrepreneurial behavior. This is what we mean by the biology of risk. Now, the thing that's really quite ironic about all this is that at that high level of stress, at the high level of uncertainty, in that red zone, when everything is kind of uncertain and volatile and no one knows what's going on, that is exactly the time that we as individual leaders need to be entrepreneurial. That's when our business needs us to be entrepreneurial. That's when the society and the economy really needs us to be completely entrepreneurial. And we find that, ironically, it's the level of cortisol that actually stops that risk aversion and actually stops us, that really creates that risk aversion and stops us from being entrepreneurial. And that's quite ironic, because that's exactly not what we need. So we find then that the fourth reason that we don't see the future is that in volatile and uncertain conditions, particularly those that continue for a while, this prevents us from seeing the future unfolding in front of us and being able to do something about it. Now, there's some real implications about that, and I'll get to that very, very shortly. Okay, so I think what we need to just do now is really think about what kind of things we're able to do in order to see the future. And I'm just going to stop for a moment and see if there are any questions that anyone would like to ask. But the point that I'm really trying to make so far is that there are a lot of evolutionary and biological reasons why we are unable to see the future. One of the things we actually know, if I just go back to my last diagram, is that the anticipation of uncertainty is obviously and often much worse than the uncertainty itself. And that's something I think we've all experienced. It's the anticipation of going to the dentist, which provides more trauma than actually sitting in the dentist's chair. So this kind of notion of cortisol rising and changing the way we are actually able to deal with uncertainty is really quite a significant issue for us. And it's one of the factors that really prevent us from seeing the future unfolding in front of us. All right, so let's now go to the next point here, which is, well, this next section, which is really something I want to talk about, and that is what can we do to improve our ability to see the future? Now, in essence, what we're talking about here is really forming a very different relationship with uncertainty and risk. And so I'm going to start, there's 6 factors that I really want to talk about, and this often would hold the answers to how we might improve our performance in seeing the future, particularly in uncertain environments. So starting with this concept of uncertainty and risk, one of the things that I noticed as I consult and indeed as a non-executive director on 2 organizations actually know about is that we usually treat uncertainty or the risks of uncertainty as an equation. What do I mean by that? Well, what we tend to do is we tend to we tend to identify all those things that we're uncertain about that represent a risk to us in our business, in our organization. And we compile a risk register. And we measure the probability of the risk occurring as high, medium, or low, or we give it a percentage, 20%, 30%, 40%. So we kind of treat uncertainty then as an equation. And, the irony, of course, is that often once we've done that, once we've really completed our risk register, we kind of push that aside and forget about it, and then just kind of worry about what are we going to do. So in a sense, the risk and uncertainty doesn't really play a significant part in the way we think about the future and the growth of our organization. So that's really what we mean by risk or uncertainty being treated as an equation. But we also need to think about the fact that uncertainty is a space. It's a space in which opportunity can occur. And I think because of that, if we start thinking about opportunity as a space, it really should change the way we use our understanding of uncertainty in the way we make decisions about the future of our organization. So I have this kind of quote that I often repeat to people, and people get a bit shocked by that. I say, let uncertainty become your friend. It's actually your friend. Why? Because it can reveal the pathways into the future. So don't hide it away in a risk register. Deal with it as part of your strategy and deal with it as part of your thinking about the future. because it represents pathways into the future. How does that happen? Well, I'm going to give you an example here. In this example, the issue facing this organization in one of our major cities in Australia was how to plan for the future of their transport infrastructure. Now, when you plan public infrastructure like this, it's usually a 10 to 15 year time horizon that you need to use. So the question that was asked was, how should we really think about the future 10 to 15 years time as far as transport infrastructure is concerned? Because we need to make plans, we need to start investing, we need to start building capabilities to really ensure that in 10 to 15 years time, we have the right kind of infrastructure. I guess the conversation evolved into, well, what are the things we're uncertain about here? And, after much research and debate, turns out that there were two key uncertainties that the city faced. The first was, how much need would there be for its citizens to travel? Now, that's got to do with a lot of factors. It's got to do with how long will the pandemic last? Will employers allow people to work from home? Is there enough infrastructure for internet and high-speed kind of internet, particularly Wi-Fi and fiber networks? And would they want to travel? So in a sense, that whole factor, which is really a lot of things to do with whether people can or whether they needed to travel, was a key uncertainty. The other major uncertainty is really related to the willingness that people had to share transport, whether it was ride sharing, whether it was actually kind of using these go cars, which are actually shared cars, or whether it was actually just using public transport. Was there a high propensity to share? Were people happy to travel alongside other people in the morning and in the afternoon to and from work or wherever they were going at whatever time of the day? Because I know that a lot of people do, but a lot of people don't. Or is there a low propensity to share? Do people actually prefer, and will they prefer to sit alone in their massive big SUVs driving on our overcrowded roads at 7:30 in the morning trying to get to work? And that's a psychological factor as much as it is about wanting a bit of privacy and not wanting to spend time in close contact with other people. Now, what you'll see is that in each case, what we do is we take those uncertainties and we look at the logical extremes. No need to travel, much need to travel. High propensity to share, no propensity, low propensity to share. So if you really put those two together, you get four very different views of what the future might look like. In the bottom right-hand corner, you have a high need to travel with a low propensity to share. Well, one of the things you need to do here is that you really do need to build massive road infrastructure, 6-lane highways, bridges, tunnels, and make sure that you can actually manage the surge of traffic in the morning and in the evening. On the top left-hand side, you find there's a very high propensity to share and not much need to travel. Well, here, of course, your answer becomes much better public transport, much better use of shared cars, but also perhaps an installation of much better and much faster kind of internet infrastructure and really helping people to work comfortably and effectively from home. So you can kind of see the way we plan the future of our infrastructure really depends on the way that the future might unfold, and we better start thinking about all of those futures. So in a sense then, the uncertainty can be your friend and it can help you reveal pathways into the future. The second way of really improving your ability to see into the future is to purposefully build memories of the future, both episodic by trying new things and semantic by learning new things. So for example, undertaking field trips, going to see how companies do it in other parts of the world or other countries or other cities, reading case studies about successful organizations that failed perhaps to do things. And the one that I like is this use of analogy and metaphor. And I think that, you know, the world of design thinking shows us a very powerful way to do this. There's a concept in design thinking called alternative worlds. And let's assume, for example, that we're engaged in trying to improve the experience for patients in a hospital. We don't really know how to go about doing this. So one way to really approach this is to ask yourself, what's another world where there's a multiple range of services which are all being directed at a single user or a few users at a time? And the answer might be a five-star hotel. And so in a sense, one of the things that a hospital could do, or people that were running a private clinic could do, or any form of health facility, is go and study what a hospital, what a five-star hotel does. Because in a hospital, you've got nurses, surgeons, registrars, pharmacists, all trying to kind of meet the needs of the patient and trying to coordinate their efforts to provide a total healing experience. In a five-star hotel, you've got food and beverage, housekeeping, front office, and so on, all trying to coordinate their activities to create an integrated experience for the guest. So I think there are a number of ways in which this alternative world could really be used. You might, for example, say, well, we're looking to become more creative. Ask ourselves, well, how might Disney solve this problem? Or what did Amazon do to kind of solve this problem? Or what does Google do to develop a new innovative business model? How's Tesla built its organization? Or what does Uber do? And how has it really managed to improve and change the conventional kind of system whereby you hail a cab? So building purposeful memories, because every time you start thinking of an alternative world, every time you start using an analogy or a metaphor, you actually create different memory structures, different frameworks, which allows you to really think about what's going on in a completely different way. So it's something that I'm particularly useful with, that I find particularly useful. And the whole idea of design thinking is a powerful way to improve your ability to see the future and to see alternative futures. The third thing I think is to recognize that you actually have to actively manage the risk appetite in your organization. Your risk appetite is actually variable. So for many years, we've tended to think that risk appetite is a function of personality, and it doesn't change. We say some people are risk takers and other people are not. Now, obviously, there are some predispositions that we have in our personality which make us more risk averse or less risk averse. But in general, we don't always recognize the role that the context actually plays. So the first thing to do is to recognize your own changing risk appetite, to recognize at what point are you trying to make a decision? At what stage are you at? Are you at a point where things are not very uncertain, or things are continuously volatile and uncertain? And recognize that your own risk appetite will change. But I think something that's really interesting here is to actually recognize, as we do in Agile, that short bursts of change in your organization, like an Agile sprint, is a powerful way of inducing entrepreneurial behavior where there is more risk-related activity and decision-making being taken. Obviously, it needs to be supported by relevant amounts of psychological safety. And the point about that is that avoiding continuous volatility, change, and uncertainty in your organization. So what actually happens here is that if the organization is in a constant state of turmoil, of uncertainty, of changes, we're changing the structure, then we're changing the process, then we introduce a new business model, then we actually shift people around and where they're sitting. It's kind of like this notion of a death by 1,000 cuts, Because if you can just imagine, people are sitting there tense, waiting for when the next change will come. They don't know, but they're anticipating every morning they walk into the office. There's another memo on their computer that's going to tell them about yet another change in that organization. And as you can see from the red zone in the diagram just above, that produces almost always a complete level of risk aversion and no entrepreneurial behavior. So I guess the point here from a leader's point of view is try to package the uncertainty and volatility as best you can. Sometimes I know the environment is continuously changing, but if you can actually have bursts of change and volatility, which you announce and say, right, for the next week, we are going to engage in a very agile sprint where we're going to develop a new structure, we're going to develop a new process, we're going to think about this new product. And once we've settled that, we'll at least enter a period of stability again until the next agile sprint is announced. Well, if you do that, your chances of getting higher levels of entrepreneurial behavior, of actually seeing and creating the future, are much better than keeping people on their toes all the time, continuously. Because as we know, the cortisol levels are high. The risk factors, you don't even consciously become aware of it, but it is affecting your ability to think and make decisions and take risks. So that's the third way that you might deal with this issue. The fourth way is actually quite an interesting one. And I find that often people haven't really thought about this very clearly, but it's really important to think about strategy and planning separately. I mean, I know we have this term called strategic planning, which is a bit of an oxymoron to me because, you know, strategy is really all about learning new things. It's about trying to get new insights and breakthrough ideas about what we might do and what this information means. And quite simply, it uses divergent thinking, broad associative thinking, which actually is the use of things like design thinking, alternative worlds, analogy, and metaphor. Whereas planning is about doing. It's a focused approach to achieve specific objectives and outcomes, and it uses a very logical and a very linear approach to actually achieving outcomes. So they're two very different processes, and they are best separated. They need to be connected clearly in the overall process, but the forum at which you conduct strategy has got to be quite different and usually separate from the forums that you use to conduct planning, because action is often the enemy of thought. When you're in high action mode, high planning mode, you're not doing a hell of a lot of reflection. You're not doing a lot of things that generate and help you to generate insight to actually kind of come up with new ways of thinking. And often the problems are complex as you look into the future, and you can't simply use those approaches you've been using in the past. You cannot solve complex problems by using linear thinking, which I think is self-evident. Number 5, I think you've got to pause and take the opportunity to reflect on a regular basis, but particularly where you face problems about the future, complex problems. And I think understanding the process of strategic thinking is quite helpful in this regard. Now, I'm not suggesting that these 3 phases are always linear. They don't always follow each other sequentially. But essentially, the 3 parts to thinking strategically or making decisions in a strategic way are identifying the facts, and then kind of boiling those facts down by grouping and regrouping them, abstracting them, if you like, to find out, you know, what's this data really mean? And then finally to figuring out what is the approach that we should take to solve the problem. Now, why have we colored them green and blue? It's quite simply because the blue phases are what we call the use of logic. They're linear processes. Whereas the insight phase, which is the middle phase, is quite a different process. And the term insight should give you some clue as to where it comes from. It doesn't come from studying the data. It comes from inside your head. It comes from reflection. So if you think about how you do analysis, how you kind of operate logically, you do it by concentrating and by focusing, by really paying attention to the data, the information, to immersing yourself in the system, in the data, in the information, in the problem. But insight is derived through retreating and reflecting. Insight does not come when you're actually running at 100 miles an hour. Insight doesn't come in an action-orientated environment. Insight doesn't come when you're spending long hours concentrating and focusing on the problem at hand. So the question here is, are you making enough time to really achieve that reflection, that development of insight that you need to really create the breakthroughs? So some of the things you can do to kind of find out if you are creating enough opportunity for reflection. Have a look at your last 6 or 7 leadership meeting agendas and ask yourself, what are the proportion of the items you've discussed? What proportion are operational? So how much are you really talking about the plans and the milestones? Schedule some time to do thinking. Go to a quiet place regularly with a notebook and pen, not with a computer or an iPad. Okay, we still know from repeated studies of learning and thinking that a paper and pen combination or notebook and pen combination is a much more effective way to reflect and capture those insights that might occur. And try to add some thinking time to your meeting agendas. And best to do that before the operational matters are discussed, because action always drives out the reflection, the insight. So first do your thinking. And if you need to run them both in the same meeting, first do your strategic thinking and then turn to the operational matters like planning and checking schedules and making sure your KPIs are all being met. So make opportunity for reflection, get onto the balcony, leave behind the challenge. Imagine you're on a balcony and you're looking down onto the dance floor. So when you're on the dance floor, you're just concentrating really on making sure you don't step on the other person's toes or you don't bump into the other people around the dance floor. But when you get onto the balcony and you look down on the dance floor, you're actually seeing something completely different. You're really seeing the dance floor's a bit too small here. Gee, you know, the music we're playing isn't correct. You're having a different level of perspective. So this is really about making an opportunity for reflection, getting up on the balcony, going to your favorite space, walking in the bush, seeing green, listening to music, read a story to your kids. That's often where these insights occur, when you're away from the work environment. And the last one. You always hear about this. Rise up to the challenge, young man or young woman or young lady. Grab it and grab the bull by the horns. Now, what actually happens when you rise to the challenge? What actually happens, of course, is your cortisol kind of just shoots up. Your emotions are sky high. And we know that the smart part of your brain, the brain that is actually capable of your kind of higher level thinking, isn't really operating in that space. So the point that's really made by airlines, and Qantas makes this point to its pilots, if there's a mid-air emergency, it's not like the movies tell you, where the pilot walks into the cockpit and says, step aside, I'm taking the controls and I'm going to save this aircraft. And then the pilot actually saves the airplane from, crashing into the mountain or doing something like that. No, what they tell you to do, what they tell the pilots to do is they say, go back to your manuals, go back to your training, and actually look at the procedures that have to be followed when this type of problem occurs. So don't rise to the challenge, fall back instead on your training and the procedures that you've actually learned, because those have been established in your semantic memory And that can be the access to much clearer thinking and much better responses than simply acting with high levels of emotion. Okay, so just to quickly summarize where we're up to, and then I'm happy to take some questions. I think what we know is that uncertainty produces more than one future, multiple futures, and we need to be across those. We need to understand how it affects our planning. We know that there are a range of things that prevent us from seeing the future, make it harder for us. Lazy brains, fear of difference, difference equals danger, and lack of memory makes it really hard for us to see the future. We also know that our risk appetite and those of our staff and people in the organization is variable, depends on the context. Short, sharp bursts of change and volatility are better than continuous, never-ending change and volatility. And while the environment's doing that, the leader's role is to ensure that a different kind of environment exists within the organization if the leader wants to get more entrepreneurial behavior. And so we can achieve a better way of seeing the future by allowing the uncertainties to become pathways, indicators to the future, using it as part of your strategy process, not just parking it in a risk register. Purposefully building new semantic memories, going on field trips, using case studies, setting up alternative world exercises to think creatively and strategically about the possibilities that exist to make the changes to suit the emerging environment. Separating our strategy and our planning processes, actually running them on different days, maybe even with different audiences, but certainly using different processes. Taking plenty of purposeful pauses, making sure that whenever there is a complex challenge which you've never encountered before, for which there is no single right answer. If there's a right answer to this problem, you just apply best practice. But if there's no single right answer, like how do you solve COVID problems? How do you solve world hunger? How do you solve poverty? How do we bring about a consensus of opinion amongst divergent stakeholders? Take time to reflect and generate insight. And ensuring that you always rely on your training in the procedures during crises, particularly if it's an emergency that you've never come across before. So I'm happy to stop sharing at this point and take any questions that anyone has. I see that there are a few comments. Thanks, Rob, for some of your comments about multiple timelines and risk registers and the difference between the two. Obviously the need to think of strategy and planning as very different exercises. Rob has said that strategy is a choosing process where you synthesize vast amounts of information, whereas planning is about executing, working out timelines and milestones. It's an analysis problem. Thank you. And thank you, Sig, I will call you. Any other questions that you have that you'd like to raise? I'm very happy to answer any questions. Maybe there aren't any questions. Maybe I answered all your questions already. Don't know, it's unusual. But any questions? Would anyone like to raise their hand and I'll unmute you? Or can I explain a bit more about memories of the future? Yeah. So a memory of anything is really a structure that enables you to make sense of something. So for example, you have if you're a doctor and you examine a patient, you've got a framework in your head, a memory, a semantic memory, all the learning, which allows you to take the pulse, look into the person's eyes, check their throat, look into their ears, and take that information and allow that to mean something to you. Whereas if I did that, because I'm not a medical doctor, if I take someone's pulse, listen to their heartbeat, look into their mouth, look into their ears and eyes, and I get all the same information, I will not be able to see what that means. So memory is really a structure which allows you to interpret different pieces of information. And that's what a memory is. We construct the memory. And that's why when we have a memory about, say, something bad, like a memory of a car accident, we can actually feel the pain still. We feel all the emotion because it is interpreted. But when we look into the future and we're seeing something which doesn't make sense to us, it means that we don't have the framework or the memory to interpret that information. And as a result, we don't see it. We just don't see it. We don't see the future. We don't see the future even though it's happening in front of us. It doesn't mean anything to us. Okay. In an executive